When I was a little kid, I lived alone with my mother. Our house was small but cozy and sat right next to a nice patch of forest that bordered a highway. I used to love playing in the backyard with my friends as a kid. We'd constantly venture into the woods and create make-believe stories of us battling all the horrible monsters that lived in the darkest corners of the woodland. Then one day, when I was 5 years old, I ventured too far. I remember pretending that there was a monster chasing me. I ran as fast as I could, further and further into the woods, and no matter how quick the monster was, I was quicker, always several steps ahead of it. It wasn't until too late that I realized that I was lost. At some point, I'd lost track of which direction I'd come from, and that deep into the forest, all the trees looked the same. But the weird thing is, I don't know what happened after that. For some reason, there's a big gap in my memory, starting after I got lost. All I know is that it was 2 days in those woods before I was found, and ever since then, I've suffered from PTSD. Except, it's not exactly PTSD. The doctors weren't sure what to call it since the symptoms are strangely specific. For the majority of my life, I'm completely unaffected, except for when my one trigger occurs. Red flashing lights cause me to experience some form of anxiety attack. I've only experienced it a few times, but the feeling is unforgettable. I get this sinking feeling deep inside my stomach, like I'm falling or drowning. My entire body freezes, and no matter how desperately I will myself to move, it's like my limbs have been cemented in place. There are a couple of theories as to what could have happened. A lot of them relate back to my mother's history of being prone to seizures, which is apparently not uncommon to be caused genetically. But she hasn't experienced any since the day I got lost. After they found me, my mother completely freaked out and completely uprooted our entire lives. We moved states immediately. My mother was determined to get as far away from the woods as possible. For the remainder of my childhood, we lived on the 3rd floor of an apartment building in a small 2-bedroom flat. By the time I'd moved out and started college, I'd mostly forgotten about the event. The effects of it still remained, but my life was mainly unaffected and it seemed like I was finally able to move past the whole incident. At least it did before what happened to me several weeks ago. It was my 2nd year of college during the summer break, and me and my roommate Nick were both visiting our families in the same state. We had bonded over the fact that we'd grown up in neighbouring towns. On my final night seeing my mother, I decided to introduce her to Nick by arranging a dinner at this little Italian place that we both loved. Dinner went fantastically. Nick and my mum exchanged embarrassing stories about me, and they seemed to be getting along well. But while we were eating our mains, a man a couple of tables over began to choke on his food, causing a large commotion. Luckily, someone gave him the Heimlich maneuver and managed to save his life. Then, while we were eating our dessert, the ambulance arrived. My vision was clouded by the flashing red lights, and I felt the familiar feeling of my heart dropping into my stomach. My mother recognized instantly what was happening, but I'd never told Nick about my condition, so he was reasonably concerned. I don't remember much of what he said or did, but after it had passed, I remember he had a lot of questions regarding my health. "So, are you okay now? Or could it start again?" he asked first. I should be all right now, I told him. It doesn't happen often, and once it passes, it shouldn't resurface unless triggered again. "So how long have you had this condition for? Let's move on," my mother said, trying to change the subject. "It started when I was 5, I told Nick, and then I explained to him the whole story from the beginning to now. "I'm so sorry," Nick said once I'd finished. "I had no idea." "It's all right. I never mentioned it before, partly because I thought this was finally beginning to pass," I said, staring awkwardly at my tiramisu. "And you really have no idea what happened during those 2 days?" Apparently, it's common for people to suppress memories of traumatic events. You probably already know about this. Nick was a cognitive science major and extensively studied human psychology, so he was always familiarizing himself with weird psychological phenomena. "It is common," Nick confirmed, looking oddly excited. In fact, your whole predicament is kind of perfect. I'm sorry? My professor and his partners, they're working on a new highly experimental procedure that's meant to help resurface trauma-repressed memories, Nick explained. You'd be the perfect test subject if you'd be willing to participate. He looked at me uneasily. Only if you're comfortable with it, of course. Absolutely not, my mother interrupted. I'd noticed that she had been becoming increasingly agitated over the course of the conversation, but this sudden outburst still surprised me. What's the matter? I asked her. We are almost past this incident, and now you want to risk yourself with a highly experimental procedure. Do we even have any idea how dangerous this could be? Past this incident? I practically exclaimed. Just a few minutes ago I was frozen to this chair. I'd hardly call that past. My mother eyed me with muted anger. How come every time I think we can finally move on, you have to try something rash and stupid? Don't you want to finally figure out what happened all those years ago? The incident that's been plaguing my life since I was 5 years old could finally reveal itself, and you want me to turn away? And what? Just move on? And then I saw a side of my mother that I'd never seen before. She didn't seem angry anymore. In fact, she seemed scared. Please, she begged me. Promise me you won't go through with this. I couldn't bear it if anything happened to you. Mum, promise me, she repeated with wide eyes. Okay, I said. I promise. I turned my attention back to Nick, who had by this point melted into his chair. He gave me an awkward smile. Even though I had told my mother that I wouldn't go through with the procedure, I later told Nick I'd changed my mind, and he had set up the appointment within weeks. I sat on the uncomfortable medical bed, staring nervously at the large metal capsule in front of it. So I just lied down? I asked to the one-way mirror. Yes, said a disembodied voice coming from the speaker in the corner. And remember, you can stop the procedure at any moment you want. I know, I confirmed. And you are aware that this procedure will likely require you to undergo serious amounts of stress, correct? Yes. All right. Please begin when you're ready. I took a deep breath. Then I lay flat along the medical bed. Within moments, the bed began to move, sliding into the metal cylinder until I was completely encased within it. Above me, a screen displayed an image of a lush forest. Do you recognize this image? The voice asked. No, I said. Is it at all similar to the forest you got lost in over a decade ago? Not exactly. Can you describe to me the precise details that are different between them? I heard a gentle hum coming from the machine. The forest I got lost in, the trees weren't that thick. A lot of them were much thinner, about the size of my head. What else? Even though the trees were thin, the forest was very dense. I didn't have to wander far before I got lost. Do you remember what happened after you got lost? No. Try to concentrate on that, the voice said. The humming began to grow louder. You were young, and you were lost for 2 days. You had to make it through 2 whole nights. Do you remember? No. Try to concentrate. The image in front of me changed to a different forest, closer to the one I'd just described, only at night. It got dark, and still no one had found you yet. You were probably scared, hungry. Do you remember? No, I repeated again, beginning to get frustrated. And then you saw something, the voice said. Something that terrified you to your very core. Something that traumatized you for the rest of your life. The flashing red lights. Do you remember? I'm telling you, I don't. Are you ready to commence the final stage? The voice asked. Yes, I said carefully. The screen changed again, this time to a flashing red strobe. My body froze immediately, and I felt that terrifying sinking feeling I'd begun to grow accustomed to. I could barely hear the voice now. You were scared, tired, hungry. You started to think that perhaps no one would ever be able to find you, and then you saw something awful, something terrible, something involving the flashing red lights. Remember what you saw. I wanted it to stop. The sound of the machine was now deafening. I wanted to scream to make it end, but I couldn't move, I couldn't speak, and then it came to me. Something clicked inside my brain, like a locked door had just burst open, and suddenly the memories of that night came to me clearer than ever. I could see it all now, like I was really there. I remembered how scared I was. I remembered how cold I was. I remembered crying until the sun set. I remembered walking through the dark forest, desperate for escape. I thought I would never make it out. I thought I was trapped forever. And then I heard a sound. And when I turned, I saw a clearing in the woods, a gap between two distant trees. I ran as fast as I could. I was so happy, so excited, so relieved. I stopped for a moment to catch my breath right before the woods ended, and I realized I was standing near the street just outside my house. And then I noticed the flashing red lights in the corner of my vision. I looked, and I saw my mother, lying flat on a gurney. She looked so cold, so lifeless. I watched the EMT drag the blanket over her, covering her face, and then she pushed the gurney into the ambulance. That's when I felt the sinking feeling deep inside my stomach, like I was falling or drowning. My entire body froze, and despite how much I willed myself to move, I couldn't. All I could do was stare forwards as the red lights filled my vision. And then I felt the cold grip on my shoulders. Something was standing behind me, and it held onto my shoulder tight. Its hand was bony and rigid, and when it spoke, its voice sounded wrong, like it was 100 voices all whispering at once. It was hard to tell from just the sound, but it must have been at least 8 foot tall. "Don't worry, my child," it said. "You're not going to miss her." I wanted to scream. I wanted to run. "I know you're scared, but everything is going to be okay." As it spoke, it began to change. Its voice became closer, like its height was decreasing, and it started to sound less like whispers and more like a human voice. The hand on my shoulder shifted from a cold, bony grasp to the warm and fleshy grip of a woman's fingers. "You aren't going to remember any of this, neither are they." As it spoke those final words, I realized the voice had changed into that of my mother's. I turned to meet her, but when I did, I saw nothing. Then I heard a scream from one of the EMTs behind me. I ran as fast as I could, further and further into the woods. I could hear the blood-curdling screams of the people behind me. I heard the shriek of metal being ripped apart. The more I ran, the more my energy diminished. My vision grew dark, and I tripped over a fallen branch, sprawling amongst the leaves and roots. My head spun, and my sight became darker and darker, until eventually I fell unconscious on the forest's floor.